Hey guys, Mr. Klein here, starting with our new chapter on the Roman Republic. The first of two chapters talking about the Romans. We'll begin with the Republic here in the first chapter, and in the next chapter we'll have the Roman Empire. This chapter will consist of three lessons, one talking about the founding of Rome, the next one talking about the Roman government, and the third one talking about troubles in the Roman Republic. So let's go ahead and get started with this. Rome, the eternal city, the home of the Vatican, the kind of the center of Christianity, if you will, Roman soldiers, Spartacus, Julius Caesar, all of this stuff came from this city here in Italy, Rome, and its impact on Western history and even world history is almost, we can't even give it justice. At one time, the Romans ruled from the Atlantic Ocean up to Scotland, out to here in the Fertile Crescent and across this rim. The entire Mediterranean Sea was under their control. Works of literature, history, and things like that were all under the control of a group of people who started out here in Italy. So let's look at the voyage, if you will, that the Roman people took on here. Now, Rome grew from a small town on the Tiber River. That's the name of the river that Rome is based on, to become a really great power, and that's what I just mentioned. And the thing is, Italy, like Greece, is a peninsula, and because it has water on all three sides, Rome had a great maritime history to it. In other words, it would trade a lot by sea. But also because the peninsula it was on was nice and large, Rome also needed a large army, and the Roman army was perhaps the greatest army of ancient history, creating tactics and stuff that we use even to this day in modern militaries. And so, like I said, because most of Italy was surrounded by water, the Romans were easily able to travel by sea. And a big thing leading to Rome's success was also the climate, because Rome's climate is actually very warm. If I show you the weather, and I'm doing this right now in the winter time, if we look up here in the UK, you have really cold 7 degrees Celsius. I zoom into the Netherlands, we're just above freezing and things like that. And this is at night in Europe. If I zoom into Rome, its temperatures are in the 50s or the teens, the lower teens Celsius. And this is the winter, the late autumn, early winter time. As a result, it being warm like that, growing crops was not difficult at all. And as a result, the Romans had plenty of food, and the concept of starvation and things like that weren't a problem. So the civilization was allowed to flourish greatly. Now, a lot of the history of Rome, especially the early history, has kind of been buried by history, if you will, like, things going on and history moving forward civilization-wise. But also it's been obscured a lot of legend. A few ancient ruins show that Roman people lived there as early as around 800 BC. So compared to the other civilizations we talked about, the Romans started really late. Now, because of these humble histories, and when Rome covered all of that area, they wanted to show how mighty Rome was and how Rome always was destined to rule this area. They wanted a glorious past. So they created stories about their history. And there's two stories we want to talk about. Early Romans believed that their history began with the hero Aeneas, rather. Aeneas fled Troy after the Trojan War. There's some ancient Greek writings about Aeneas and things like that. And later on in Roman history, an author wrote an epic poem called the Aeneid. It was written by a guy named Virgil, and here is a statue of Virgil's head, minus his nose and a big scar on his cheek. But Virgil wrote a long poem similar to Odysseus in the Odyssey, essentially explaining what happens. So what happens is, whereas in the Trojan Wars, the victorious Greeks conquer the Trojans, thus ending the Trojan Wars with the Trojan horse and stuff like that, rather the Aeneid came from the other side. And there was this guy named Aeneas, and Aeneas was a brave and loyal soldier from Troy. And he gathers up survivors. He's one of the few survivors that isn't sold into slavery, and he escapes along this route. In the Aeneid talks about this, and as he goes through, he goes to Crete, he comes around here on the side of Greece, goes through Sicily, even goes sees Carthage, and ends up in this area, Latium. And him and his followers meet the people who live in Latium called the Latins, and they move to Italy and they settle this area. And thus, Rome has a link to the ancient Greeks and the greatness of the Greek people and stuff like that. So, obviously, Rome was supposed to rule the ancient world because they came from the mighty Trojans who fought against the Greeks in the Trojan Wars. Now, another more traditional kind of Roman centered legend about Rome's founding was by a pair of twins named Romulus and Remus. And they were twins, and what was interesting about them was that they were found by shepherds nursing with a she-wolf. And if you look at the seal of the city of Rome, the symbol, if you will, you'll see Romulus and Remus, the twins, nursing underneath the she-wolf. And shepherds found them, and they raised them up. And what ended up happening was Romulus ended up killing Remus and taking over the Roman people and becoming their first king. Hence, Rome being named after Romulus. But history is probably a bit less exciting than that. So there's probably no children raised by wolves or Aeneas and legions of brave immortal warriors, if you will, settling in Rome. Rather, settlers settled down in the area and they formed a kingdom. And Rome was ruled by a king until it became a republic. And this is something we're going to really get into in the next lesson when we talk about the Roman government, how a republic's different than a democracy. But let's talk about the early Roman Republic here. In the Roman Republic, citizens elected leaders to represent them. And if you remember our earlier lesson on the Greek democracy, the Athenian democracy, we talked about how in Athens, everybody was supposed to participate in government. I mean, provided if you were a native with parents from Athens and you were a male and you were a landowner. But pretty much everybody, if you will, compared to a kingdom, had that. In the Roman Republic, citizens elected people to create laws for them instead. And that's the big difference between a republic and a democracy. And what happened in the early Roman Republic was once they got rid of their king, they were really scared of having another king. And so they created rules for the Roman Republican government to stop this from happening. For example, elections to the Republic were held once a year to prevent people from being too powerful. And you couldn't even go up for election again, like to lead the Roman government, for another 10 years if you were elected. So you could only serve for 1 year, and then you couldn't even try again for another 10. And the early Republic's biggest problem, and this is something of Rome's heritage, was that it was at war with everyone. It was particularly its neighbors. Rome and its empire grew not through diplomacy, but rather diplomacy at the point of a spear or a point of a sword. Rome was always at war and was always spreading around with their neighbors, a very rich military heritage. And because they were at war with everyone all the time, obviously, this caused problems. And the Roman Republican government, sometimes you needed just one person to be put in charge. And so what happened during times of war is that Romans elected dictators. That's where we get the word dictator from. And they were rulers with almost absolute power. So if they went to war, what they would do is they would elect one guy, and he'd be the dictator, and everybody would have to do what he said. So he'd be kind of like an absolute king. But here's the thing. He would only stay in power for 6 months. And after that, he was kicked out and he couldn't rule anymore, and it went back to his Republican form. Now, the most famous dictator of all of the Roman Republican period was a guy named Cincinnatus. Okay, Cincinnatus, which, if you're American, you know the name Cincinnati. Well, it's named after this guy. Cincinnatus was essentially a ruler, and in order to pay for a punishment for a murder that his son committed, he was kicked out and he became a farmer. And this is Cincinnatus right here. And so Rome was in trouble. There were some neighboring peoples that they were going to go to war with. Cincinnatus was a farmer, and they came to Cincinnatus for help. And they were like, "Oh, Cincinnatus, come and help us." And so he did, and he became general. He went on out and he defeated, like in a and really quick, he defeated the enemies to Rome. And as soon as the war was over, like as soon as the ink was dried on like the treaty saying that the war was over, he retired and went back to being a citizen. Sorry, a farmer rather. And in fact, he even did this twice. Okay, so they came back to him another time. He goes and fights a war for Rome, defeats the enemies, comes back, and as soon as it's over, saying, I'm going back to my tractor and my plows. At which is an idea that we saw moving forward in American history with George Washington, where the Society of Cincinnatus was formed to have these civic ideas of that your job is not to, as a leader, is not to take and hold power, but to rather serve the country. George Washington, whenever he was president, he served 2 terms, he retired at the end of the 2 terms because he said his job was over, and in fact he cited Cincinnatus as one of the people that he wanted to be like. Now, we need to talk about Rome's social structure. And citizens were either one of 2 people. One were plebeians, who, and add an E right there, plebeians were common people, or patricians. Patricians were people who could rule Rome. So you had 2 groups of people, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to look at the pyramid right here in a minute. So you had citizens, and most people, for the most part, in Rome actually were citizens. The vast majority of them were plebeians, they were common people, but the ruling class, the people who ruled Rome, who made the rules and stuff, were patricians. Let's look at this, the pyramid. At the top, you had the patricians. They were wealthy landowners. They were the traditional founding families of Rome. They had particular last names and things like that. Below them were the plebeians, which were actually most Roman citizens. You were a poor farmer, you were a merchant, things like that. You were a plebeian. You could eventually buy your way into this later on in the Republic, but at first, the plebeians and patricians were completely separated. In fact, patricians couldn't marry plebeians. They almost couldn't even do business with them. There was such a divide between the 2. And below them were 2 groups of people. You had freedmen who were former slaves who had either bought their freedom or were freed or things like that. And below them you had the slaves. Now, slavery in Roman times is a bit different than what we think of in terms of American slavery. Slaves, you could sell yourself into slavery because of debt. You could have been captured in a war, things like that. Or and you could buy your way out of slavery, or if your master died, you could be freed. And then you would move up into the freedmen, and over time your family could eventually move into the idea of plebeians. And so this sets the stage for Roman society during the Republic period, which lasts for about 500 years. So to sum up this lesson, we talked about Rome and how Rome was set up in Italy, which is a peninsula here in the Mediterranean Sea, and its land and climate was really suited for a civilization to flourish. And we don't know too much about early Rome because the Romans created 2 separate stories to explain their origins. The first was written later in its history, called the Aeneid by a guy named Virgil, talking about a heroic warrior from Troy named Aeneas who sails across the Mediterranean and settles with natives called the Latins to form it. The other one was a pair of twins raised by a she-wolf named Romulus and Remus, and Romulus, one of the twins, ends up becoming the first king of Rome. And after about 300 years, the Romans get rid of their king and they set up a republic with some unique ideas that during time of war, you could have a dictator rule like a king, but at 6 months or the end of the war, he would have his powers removed, the most famous of which was Cincinnatus. And the Roman society was divided into 2 groups of people. There were the patricians, who were the wealthy landowners, and the plebeians, which were the citizens. And below them you had slaves and freed slaves, but the main people that we'll talk about moving forward in Roman government were the patricians and plebeians. So there you go. That's your lesson. As always, if you have any questions, please let me know, and thanks for watching.
It's playing at my house. I'll show you the ropes, kid. Show you the ropes.